Picture 60 million acres of Queensland farmland completely swallowed alive. Not by flood, not by fire, not by drought, but by a cactus that arrived in a flower pot and never stopped growing. By 1925, prickly pear had consumed an area larger than the entire United Kingdom, advancing at a rate of 1 million acres per year, and every single thing humans threw at it made absolutely no difference whatsoever. What eventually stopped it was not a machine, not a chemical, not an army of workers with axes. It was a moth the size of your thumbnail that nobody had ever heard of, doing something that scientists at the time genuinely did not believe was possible. The plant that ate Queensland. There is a photograph that stops people cold. It shows a Queensland farmhouse somewhere outside Chinchilla, taken around 1922, and the house is not visible. Not because the photograph is poorly framed, not because something is obscuring the lens. The farmhouse is simply gone, buried completely behind a wall of prickly pear cactus that has grown so tall and so dense that the building behind it has ceased to exist as a visible object in the landscape. A family lived there, they had cleared that land themselves, and the cactus took it back in a time frame that felt, to everyone watching it happen, less like an ecological event and more like a punishment. Prickly pear is the common name applied to several species of the genus Opuntia, flat-padded cacti native to the Americas that produce a fruit eaten across Mexico and the Mediterranean to this day. In their home environment, these plants are kept in check by a web of insects, fungi, and grazing animals that evolved alongside them over millions of years, none of which existed anywhere in Australia. Bring a plant to a continent that has never seen it before, and you remove every biological break that kept it honest back home. What you get on the other side of that equation is what Queensland got. Estimates from the peak years of the infestation describe something almost impossible to visualize from a distance. By 1925, approximately 60 million acres of land across Queensland and northern New South Wales had been rendered entirely unusable for farming or grazing. To put that in terms that land it properly, that is an area larger than the United Kingdom, larger than all of Japan, larger than the entire state of Victoria with room left over, covered so thoroughly in interlocking cactus pads, stacked up to 2 meters high that cattle could not walk through it, plows could not cut it, and in some areas a person on horseback could not find a way in at all. The spread was not gradual in the way people imagine when they hear the word invasive. This was aggressive, almost deliberate seeming expansion at a rate that shocked even the scientists who were supposed to be monitoring it. 1 million acres per year was the figure being reported by the late 19-teens. By the early 1920s, that figure had accelerated. Every single pad that broke off a parent plant and landed on bare soil was capable of taking root independently. Every single fruit that a bird ate and deposited somewhere new was a potential new colony. The plant reproduced in multiple directions simultaneously, and it reproduced faster than any human response could follow. Farmers who had spent years clearing land, pulling stumps, building fences, laying down homesteads, watched the cactus advance across their paddocks and had no meaningful answer for it. Some simply walked away. Property values across the affected regions collapsed. Towns that had been growing steadily through the early years of the Federation period began losing population. The Queensland government was receiving petitions from landholders describing conditions that sounded, in the language of the official correspondence of the time, more like a biblical account than an agricultural report. The land was gone, not damaged, not degraded, gone, and nobody had any idea what to do about it. A weed, with friends in high places. Someone deliberately brought this plant to Australia. That is the part of the story that tends to produce a particular kind of silence when people hear it for the first time, because the scale of what followed makes the original decision feel almost cosmically irresponsible in retrospect. But the people who introduced prickly pear were not reckless or stupid. They were operating with complete confidence inside a colonial framework that treated the introduction of useful plants from elsewhere in the empire as straightforwardly good policy. And that framework, as it turned out, had no mechanism for asking what happens next. The first recorded introduction arrived with the first fleet in 1788. The specific variety was selected deliberately, chosen because it was the host plant for the cochineal insect, a small-scale bug from which a vivid red dye is extracted that was, at the time, enormously valuable for dyeing British military uniforms. The plan was to establish a cochineal dye industry in the new colony. The cochineal industry never took off in Australia, which is, as it turns out, the least interesting part of this story. The cactus stayed regardless because nobody thought to remove something that had arrived with official endorsement and had not yet done anything visibly wrong. Additional Opuntia species followed over the coming decades. Some arrived as ornamental garden plants because, and I want you to sit with this for just a moment, people genuinely thought they looked nice. Several varieties were planted deliberately as living hedges along property boundaries, a practice that made complete sense before anyone understood what the plant was capable of doing in an environment that had never developed anything capable of controlling it. Queensland settlers were actively encouraged in some early agricultural literature to plant prickly pear as a drought-resistant fodder crop for cattle. This advice was spectacularly wrong on almost every level simultaneously, but it was given in good faith by people who had no framework for understanding what they were recommending. By the mid-1800s, the spread was already visible to anyone paying close attention. Colonial naturalists recorded the plant moving beyond garden boundaries and into surrounding bushland with increasing frequency. Some expressed concern in their correspondence and in early scientific papers. Those concerns did not produce any meaningful policy response, partly because the scale of what was coming was genuinely difficult to anticipate from the early stages of an invasion that still looked manageable, and partly because the colonial administration of Queensland was dealing with approximately 17 other crises at any given moment, and a spreading ornamental cactus did not initially rank among the urgent ones. That delay was the foundational error that made everything that followed inevitable. Each year the response was deferred, the plant's foothold deepened, its distribution widened, and the threshold beyond which simple removal became impossible crept quietly closer. By the time the scale of the crisis was impossible to ignore, it had already been impossible to solve by conventional means for years. A plant arrived with no natural enemies, was actively and enthusiastically distributed across a continent by people who considered it useful, and crossed the point of no return while the administrators responsible for the landscape were looking somewhere else. The colonial mindset that imported and promoted prickly pear did not account for ecological consequence. It rarely did. The land that paid the price for that omission was not the administrators' land. It was the farming families who walked away from properties they had spent years building, the rural communities that lost their economic foundations, and beneath all of them, the Aboriginal peoples whose country this had been for 50,000 years before anyone planted the first Opuntia pad in a colonial garden and called it an improvement. Everything they tried and failed. The Queensland government did not sit still. To be completely fair to the people dealing with this crisis through the 1910s and 1920s, they tried almost everything anyone could think of, and they tried it with genuine urgency and significant public funding. The problem was not lack of effort. The problem was that prickly pear in the Australian landscape was functionally unkillable by any method that could be applied at scale. Manual clearing was the first approach, and it was exactly what it sounds like. Workers with axes, mattocks, and heavy gloves went into the cactus and cut it down by hand. The immediate results looked encouraging. The problem revealed itself afterward, when every single pad that had been severed and left on the ground took root independently and grew a new plant. Manual clearing did not reduce the cactus. In many areas, it demonstrably accelerated the spread by distributing viable plant material across a wider area than the original colony had occupied. Workers were, without knowing it, farming prickly pear at industrial scale. Fire was tried next, with similarly counterproductive results. Prickly pear does not burn cleanly or consistently. The water content of the pads is high enough that even in dry conditions, the plants resist ignition, and when a fire does move through a dense stand of cactus, it tends to clear the competing vegetation around the cactus without meaningfully reducing the cactus itself. Post-fire regrowth from surviving root systems was rapid. Several landholder accounts from the period describe watching a burned paddock return to full cactus cover within 2 growing seasons of the fire that was supposed to have cleared it. Chemical poisoning was the next attempt. Various arsenic-based compounds were sprayed across affected areas at significant expense and with genuine logistical difficulty, given the remoteness of much of the infested country. Arsenic killed prickly pear effectively when applied directly and in sufficient concentration. It also killed everything else in the surrounding area, poisoned waterways, and remained in the soil long enough to prevent productive agricultural use of the land it was supposed to be recovering. The cure was creating almost as many problems as the disease, and at a cost per acre that made total treatment of 60 million acres an economic impossibility, regardless of how willing the government was to fund it. Mechanical crushing equipment was developed and deployed. Enormous rollers dragged behind tractors designed to physically flatten and destroy cactus stands. The machinery worked exactly as designed in terms of crushing the plants. The plants, as had become a recurring theme by this point, simply regrew from the fragments. Farmers watching the machinery move across their paddocks felt something that the accounts of the period describe with a particular kind of exhausted despair. They could see it working, and they knew from experience that it wasn't working. By the early 1920s, the situation had the character of a slow emergency that the available tools genuinely could not resolve. The Queensland and New South Wales governments had spent, by various estimates, enormous sums across multiple approaches over multiple decades, and the cactus was larger than it had ever been. Someone in government eventually asked a different question, not what can we throw at this plant, but what eats it back home. The scientists who went looking for a killer. The Prickly Pear Travelling Commission was formed in 1912, which is an excellent name for a government body, and also an extremely early indicator that conventional approaches were already being quietly abandoned. The Commission's mandate was to investigate whether biological control, the deliberate introduction of a natural enemy to control an invasive species, could be applied to the prickly pear crisis. This was not a common idea in 1912. It was, by the standards of the time, a fairly radical one. Biological control had been attempted before in other parts of the world with mixed results. The concept was straightforward. Find whatever is keeping this plant manageable in its home environment, identify the specific organism responsible, bring it to the invaded country, and let it do what it does naturally. The difficulty was that doing this recklessly could replace one ecological disaster with another, importing a new species that turned out to be as destructive as the original problem. Everyone involved understood that getting this wrong had consequences. The Commission sent researchers to North America and then to South America, specifically Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil, which are the native heartlands of the Opuntia species that had taken over Queensland. What they were looking for was an insect, fungus, or pathogen that specifically targeted prickly pear that would not switch to attacking native Australian plants if the cactus was ever reduced, and that was capable of reproducing and dispersing fast enough to actually make a dent in 60 million acres. That is, to put it plainly, a very specific shopping list. Over several years of field work, the Commission investigated approximately 150 different organisms associated with prickly pear in South America. Most were eliminated from consideration for one reason or another. Some attacked too broad a range of plants. Some would not survive the Australian climate. Some reproduced too slowly to be effective at the scale required. Some showed signs in testing that they might shift host plants under pressure, which was exactly the scenario the Commission was most afraid of producing. The moth that kept coming up in the research was Cactoblastis cactorum, a small, unremarkable-looking moth native to Argentina whose caterpillars bore into the interior of prickly pear pads and consume the plant from the inside out. In its South American home range, this moth was a known and effective natural control on Opuntia populations. The caterpillars were voracious, the moth reproduced in large numbers, and in laboratory testing, it showed a strong and consistent preference for Opuntia over any other available plant. The Commission's entomologists kept returning to it. By 1925, after years of evaluation and testing, the recommendation was formal. Cactoblastis cactorum was the candidate. The man most closely associated with what happened next was Alan Dodd, an entomologist with the Queensland Department of Agriculture who had been involved in the biological control investigation for years and who understood better than most the scale of what was being attempted. Dodd arranged for the import of Cactoblastis eggs from Argentina. The first shipment arrived in Australia in 1925, and then, with a combination of scientific rigour and what must have been a significant quantity of professional optimism, they began the moth that did the impossible. 3 billion eggs were eventually distributed. Read that number again slowly because it does not feel real the first time through, and it doesn't feel particularly real the second time either. 3 billion Cactoblastis eggs distributed by hand and by mail, actual mail, envelopes of eggs sent to landholders across Queensland and New South Wales, across the infested regions between 1926 and 1931. Landholders were instructed to place the egg sticks, small elongated clusters of eggs, the moth attaches to cactus spines, directly onto prickly pear plants on their properties and then wait. The waiting was the hard part. The eggs hatched into caterpillars that bored into the cactus pads and began feeding. Individual plants began to show signs of damage, colonies started to look stressed, but the cactus was enormous, the caterpillar populations were still building, and in the first years of the release the results were encouraging without being dramatic. Scientists were cautiously optimistic. Farmers who had watched every previous intervention fail were considerably less so, and there are accounts from the period of landholders who received their envelopes of Cactoblastis eggs, regarded them with deep personal skepticism, and complied with the instructions anyway because they had nothing left to lose. Then, somewhere around 1930, something shifted. The caterpillar populations had been building quietly for several years across an enormous geographic area, and they reached a threshold. What followed was not a gradual improvement, it was a collapse. Dense stands of prickly pear that had stood for decades began dying from within, the internal tissue consumed by caterpillar masses, working through every pad simultaneously, the plants collapsing into rotting heaps that then became breeding grounds for additional generations of the moth. The collapse cascaded outward from initial release sites in every direction. By 1932, observers in the field were describing scenes that those watching simply could not reconcile with everything they had witnessed over the preceding decades. Paddocks that had been impenetrable walls of cactus 2 years earlier were open grassland. Farmhouses that had been buried were visible again. Fence lines that had not been seen in 20 years reappeared as the cactus died back around them. Alan Dodd, writing at the time, described the speed and completeness of the collapse as beyond what anyone had predicted, even in the most optimistic projections made before the release. A monument was eventually erected near the town of Chinchilla in Queensland to commemorate what happened. This is, as far as I am aware, the only monument in the world dedicated to a moth. If there is another one somewhere, I genuinely want to know. Leave it in the comments. The Chinchilla Cactus Museum holds the history of the infestation and the biological control program in the region where the collapse was most dramatically visible, and it sits in country that was farmable again within a decade of the Cactoblastis release after having been functionally lost for a generation. By 1940, approximately 95% of the cactus that had covered 60 million acres was gone. Not reduced, not managed to a tolerable level, gone. The caterpillars had done in roughly a decade what axes, fire, arsenic, and crushing machinery had failed to do across the preceding 40 years. Cactoblastis cactorum remains to this day one of the most successful biological control programs ever recorded anywhere in the world. The scientific literature on invasive species management still cites it as the benchmark against which other programs are measured. The ripple. Nobody predicted Australia's success with Cactoblastis spread quickly through the international scientific community. Word of what had happened in Queensland reached researchers in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Mediterranean, all of whom were dealing with their own Opuntia invasion problems for essentially the same colonial era reasons that had produced Australia's crisis. The moth was collected from Australian populations and deliberately introduced to South Africa, Hawaii, the Caribbean islands, and several other locations across the mid-20th century. In almost every case, it performed exactly as it had in Queensland, collapsing invasive Opuntia populations with a speed and completeness that continued to astonish researchers who knew the outcome in advance and still found it remarkable to witness. The global reputation of biological control as a legitimate and powerful tool in invasive species management was substantially built on what happened in Queensland between 1926 and 1940. Researchers who had been skeptical of the approach pointed to Cactoblastis as the proof of concept that shifted institutional opinion. Funding for biological control programs increased in multiple countries. In the decades after the Queensland results became widely known, the tiny moth from Argentina had, in a very real sense, changed the direction of applied ecology as a scientific field. And then the uncomfortable modern chapter arrived. Cactoblastis cactorum, deliberately introduced across the Caribbean as Australia's biological gift to the world's invasive prickly pear problem, eventually spread on its own to Florida. And this was not a deliberate introduction, it was natural dispersal, the moth moving northward through the island chain and making landfall in North America sometime in the 1980s. In Florida and across the southern United States, the situation reversed. Opuntia species in North America are native, they are part of the original ecosystem, they are food sources, habitat providers, and ecologically significant plants in their home continent, and Cactoblastis cactorum was now eating them. The moth that saved Australia had become, in North America, an invasive species threatening native cacti in their home range. Conservation biologists in the United States began tracking the moth's northward spread with considerable alarm because the Opuntia species at risk include plants central to the ecology of the North American desert southwest, and some that are already listed as threatened or endangered. The biological weapon that performed flawlessly against an invasive plant in one context had been passed around the world and eventually arrived in a context where it was the problem rather than the solution. This is not an argument against what Australia did. The Queensland crisis was real, the damage was catastrophic, and biological control was the only thing that worked. It is instead a window into the deep complexity of ecological intervention at any scale, and a reminder that solutions designed for one context carry consequences into contexts that cannot always be anticipated decades and oceans away. The scientists who released Cactoblastis in Queensland made the right call with the information available to them. The scientists who spread it globally were following a logic that was entirely reasonable at the time. The result is a story with no clear villain, which turns out to be the most unsettling kind. What this place still holds? The land beneath the cactus had a history. It had always had a history, long before the first Opuntia pad was planted in a colonial garden, and long before the first Queensland farmer watched the green wall advancing across his paddock with nothing useful to do about it. The country that prickly pear consumed across southern Queensland and northern New South Wales was not empty farmland waiting to be useful. It was the traditional country of the Bigambul and Kamilaroi peoples, among others, who had lived in and managed this landscape for an estimated 50,000 years before a single cactus was ever introduced anywhere in Australia. The Bigambul people are the traditional custodians of country, stretching across the Darling Downs and into the areas around Goondiwindi, directly within the heart of the worst affected prickly pear regions. The Kamilaroi, one of the largest language groups in pre-colonial Australia, held country extending across northwestern New South Wales into southern Queensland, across the same geography the cactus would eventually consume. By the time the prickly pear crisis was reaching its peak in the 1920s, both groups had already survived something the official histories of the infestation rarely pause to mention: frontier violence, dispossession, and the systematic destruction of their communities across the preceding decades had already fundamentally disrupted the relationship between these peoples and the country the cactus was now burying. Traditional ecological knowledge of the Bigambul and Kamilaroi peoples encoded detailed understanding of this landscape, its plants, its water systems, its seasonal patterns, and the specific relationships between species that kept it functioning. This was not abstract knowledge. It was accumulated, tested, and refined across hundreds of generations of direct lived experience inside a specific environment, the same kind of deep knowledge that researchers studying the Daintree or Kalkajaka have increasingly come to understand is irreplaceable by any shorter method. When the colonial period severed the transmission of that knowledge and displaced the people who held it, the land lost something that no government commission could inventory or replace. There is a particular irony sitting inside this history that deserves to be named plainly. The prickly pear crisis unfolded across country whose traditional custodians had maintained functional, productive, ecologically stable landscapes for 50,000 years without introducing a single catastrophic invasive species. The crisis itself was created by a colonial framework that treated that accumulated knowledge as irrelevant and the land as empty. The solution, when it finally came, required scientists to travel to the opposite side of the planet to find ecological knowledge that the continent's original inhabitants had always understood locally, that landscapes require the checks and balances of their own evolved relationships to function, and that removing those relationships produces consequences that no amount of axes or arsenic can undo. The country around Chinchilla, Goondiwindi, and the Darling Downs is farmable again. It has been farmable again for decades. The grassland that returned after the Cactoblastis collapse is grazed by cattle, planted with crops, and crossed by roads that were impassable during the worst years of the infestation. The farmers who came back to land their parents had walked away from did so because of a moth. What is less visible, and what the monument near Chinchilla does not record, is the older story of the country beneath that farmland, the people who knew it before the cactus, the people who knew it before the farmers, and what was lost in between that no biological control program has ever been designed to recover. Australia's prickly pear story sits at a genuinely unusual intersection. It is simultaneously one of the greatest ecological disasters in this continent's recorded history, one of the most successful conservation interventions ever documented, and a cautionary tale about unintended consequences that is still playing out in Florida as you watch this. The moth that nobody had heard of did what armies of workers could not. It restored 60 million acres in roughly a decade, changed the direction of applied ecology globally, and then traveled the world and became someone else's problem in a different hemisphere, which, if you think about it, is a deeply Australian thing to do. Underneath all of it, older and more significant than any of it, sits the country itself, waiting, as it always has been, to be properly understood.